I'm going to start out by saying, as a former editor of a consumer magazine, you have no idea how much pressure there is not to run the kinds of pieces that Fern supports. And it's insidious because a lot of it isn't, no, you can't do that. It's, we can't sell ads against that. The audience doesn't want to read that. They just want to be entertained. And so I want to start by asking you, have you ever had a piece that you really wanted to do that your editors said no?
Yeah, but it was more for my own stupidity rather than some advertiser threatening to pull out. I've never had that happen to me, but I've been really lucky. I always felt like I was one step ahead of the curve, and I worked for New York Newsday until it died in '95, and then for the Journal just before Rupert came along, and now I kind of feel like I'm at the last sort of big media standing that still can resist that kind of pressure. So I've been really lucky, but it's an increasingly rare situation to be in.
Okay, so what kind of response did you get after the excerpt from Salt, Fat, Sugar, etc. ran in the magazine?
I mean, I think it really showed what you all know, which is that people really care about food, and they really care about what we are putting in our bodies, and not just kind of on the coast, but in the heartland. So that excerpt, I think it was about 10,000 words of the book, and it was magnificently edited by Joel Lovell at the magazine, hopefully to sort of leave you wanting more, because that's always the scariest thing about excerpting a book, which is that, okay, been there, done that. And fortunately it didn't do that, but it just rocketed to the most read, the most viewed, the most blogged story, and it just sort of took everybody, including myself, by surprise. And that got everybody from Fresh Air to Dr. Oz to Jon Stewart and the whole sort of big media wave going. Yeah, and it was just, but again, it's sort of like, it really resonated with people. I think because, we always knew that eating too much of the food that I like to say, call the food we hate to love, can make you overweight or otherwise ill. But, now we know from the documents and the interviews that the food giants have been acutely aware of that for years and years, even as they, continued adding in heaps and heaps of food. I think that's one of that was a really empowering thing to people like you in this room and just ordinary consumers who were walking into the grocery store wanting to try to level the playing field and feeling rather hopeless about it.
But you didn't get pushback from industry there, because there are a lot of cases, even when I was at the New York Times, of some giants coming in and hearing that a reporter was nosing around a story and coming in and saying, going to management and saying, if you do this story, we know something about the reporter, we will sue you. You didn't get any of that.
Not only was there sort of no pushback like that, except maybe a little bit from Coca-Cola, what really... Well, that was, so the excerpt ran, and, they had decided not to put in sentences like, oh, and by the way, Coke is now selling some bottled water, and has raised the age limit of kids it would target from, 12 to 13, all of which I dutifully reported in the book, and so they felt a little aggrieved that we didn't totally tell their side of the story. But no, not only wasn't there that kind of pushback, but the most startling thing for me was, the book sort of starts out, unlike the title, it starts with sugar, and then it goes to fat for kind of narrative reasons and other things. And when I got to salt, I hit a wall, and I knew that I couldn't come back and do some of the same thematic things that I had done with fat and sugar. And I'm going, how am I going to do this? And I go, well, who's the biggest salt maker in the country, in the world? I go, and I look it up, and I go, oh, Cargill. That same company that made that hamburger I wrote about, that crippled Stephanie Smith, the 22-year-old dance instructor. So, of course, what I do, I pick up the phone, I call Cargill and say, hey, would you guys mind talking to me? Not about E. coli this time, but salt. And they did. And that became sort of part of this huge eye-opener for me, which was the moment when I realized that these companies are more hooked on salt, sugar, and fat as miracle ingredients that let them lower the cost and increase the convenience and the preservation and pump up the irresistible taste, that they are between a rock and a hard place. That to me was kind of the most empowering part of the research and reporting, because walking the grocery store, you can almost feel sorry for this $1 trillion industry. Almost, right?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it's not as if eating is, likes and dislikes are innate. It's learned behavior. Yeah. So what I don't understand is why these companies can't accept that. I mean, you said they're ashamed. A lot of the people have privately told you that they're ashamed of what they're doing. Yeah. And they don't want to be poisoning America. If they could make a profit without poisoning America, they would do it, right? I mean, they want to make a profit. Yeah. But I don't understand why they don't just figure out how to market a different taste to Americans.
And interesting enough, some of the biggest advocates of doing just that are inside the companies, these cabals of insiders, renegades, if you will, who are truly seemingly wanting to do the right thing. But I mean, I imagine that you all have sort of, thought about the two. And so the question it raises, I mean, is a little slightly less bad for you version of their foods, that much of an improvement? Is that really what is going to get sort of the country back on a better track health-wise? So, that's one of the issues. We've talked about the pressure from Wall Street. I was astounded when the former CEO, Philip Morris, who I write about in the book, because they became the biggest food manufacturer in North America and did some actually really surprising things, having done that, said to me, look, Michael, I'm no fan of government intervention, but you got to realize these companies are so fiercely competitive with each other and so beholden to Wall Street that if for no other reason, I would think they might be amenable to government intervention just to give them some cover, just in case some of them want to do the right thing by
if
consumers.
they all did it, if they all went back to zero,
yeah.
They dialed it back, and they all said,
yeah.
we're going to make food that is
yeah.
good for you. We're
yeah.
going to stop this.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have any choice, right? And they could market it to us. Their marketers are brilliant. They could tell us that we had a choice with one. They could tell children, right? You have a choice with, it's your time.
Yeah.
The Lunchables.
Right. Yes. They are incredibly good at using marketing, and in fact, so much of their food is all about marketing as opposed to the food itself. But I mean, I think the other thing that's really driving them is that they just really dig making these foods, and when they're inside the game, as the former president of Coca-Cola sort of explained to me, when you're inside the battle, fighting Pepsi, and they weren't even really pretending to be fighting Pepsi, they were fighting for, a share of our stomachs, knowing that when they would come up with a great new ad for Coke, and Pepsi would come in with a great new ad, both ships would rise in the sea, both of them would sort of win. But they just, and that was the most fun, if you will, for me, was sitting down with their bench chemists, right? I'm gonna hand you this, and talking about, I brought you some treats, right? Talking about this stuff that they make. And one of the things I apologize for is that people will read the book and they'll start getting cravings for this stuff, because It's so intensely, just pick one of these out and we can talk about it. It's so perfectly engineered to maximize the allure. And I should speak of that too. There's no word that they hate worse than the A word, right? Addiction. They'll fight tooth and nail to keep you from calling food, their food especially, addictive, right? But the language that they use when they're talking to each other, they think privately, to describe their efforts to maximize the allure is every bit as revealing. They talk about craveability, snackability. Here's my favorite. It's not in the book, but I came across it the other day from Howard Moskowitz. More-ishness. Right?
More-ishness.
As in M-O-R-E, right? I mean, these are not English majors. As I said, these are bench chemists. They talk about the Cheetos as having something called vanishing caloric density. So all the snack chip manufacturers try to get a ratio of fat of 50%. So 50% of the calories come from the fat, and that provides the perfect amount of what they call the mouthfeel of fat. But with something like this, what happens, you put it in your mouth, you press it against your tongue, we'll try this, and it disappears, right? It just sort of like melts. And that's sort of the...
I have to admit, I love these.
No, it's gone. I gotta grab water too. Oh my God. But, so when that happens, the signal that sends to the brain, they have called the vanishing caloric density, which means this really fatty caloric food, the calories suddenly have disappeared. So thinks the brain, and so it's fooled by the melting of the product.
And you must have another one.
Not only that, but you might as well be eating celery for all that your brain cares about.
Well, let me just ask you a question since we're on Cheetos.
Yeah.
It is extremely hard to find this kind of Cheeto. Now, they have now changed them to the crisp ones that don't vanish in your mouth.
You mean that's a little harder shell, you have to crunch some more?
Well, they don't do this vanishing, evaporating thing. They're crispy. They're not nearly as good.
Maybe our brains have caught on. I don't know. I still find these. I mean, these are from, the 7-Eleven on 40-something Street. I mean, I could have bought them in any local drugstore, too, I think. So the crispy thing, that's sort of a thing called dynamic contrast. So they really love, the Oreos is sort of the epitome of that. It's got the outer, cookie with the dark color and then the soft, gooey inner. I know you're not going to resist that, Ruth, right? And that contrast is like really yours. Look, chefs know this too. And look again. The problem isn't salt, sugar, fat. It's incredible heaps that go into processed foods that the worst chef will have trouble coming up with. But there's a contrast between crispy on the outside, gooey on the inside, tells the brain that, this is theory, right? Back when we were on the plains of Africa evolving, the whole thing was, don't eat from just that one bush. You've got to get lots of nutrients. And so the brain would tell you when you're getting too much of one texture. Help me if I'm going wrong here, Mary. This all comes from Mary, not so believe me. And so another great term, right, is sensory-specific satiety, which is now we get to one of the huge ones, right? So Coca-Cola is the height of what food scientists call forgettability. So it has a couple dozen mystery secret ingredients, but none of that really matters. What matters is that when you sip the Coke, besides the bubbles and the sugar, of course, but when you sip it and you...
It's okay, I hate Coke.
You have a good story on Coke. When you sip it, none of those ingredients stick in your brain. You know, the wow and the overall wow, I love that, that's great, does, but none of the individual ingredients. So you don't, an hour from now you're thinking, oh, that was a real citrusy thing, or boy, I could really taste that. What else is in Coca-Cola?
Well, I mean, this is what they call in Chinese food strange taste, right? Where you combine things in such a way that it's undefinable, and it's actually a term in Chinese cooking, strange taste.
Perfectly blended, so no one ingredient trips that phenomena called sensory-specific satiety, where the brain goes, you've had enough of those berries on that bush now, move on to something else. And that's something you find a lot, and that became one of the key things as the food companies started emulating Coca-Cola, and to some extent Pepsi, and to a lesser extent Dr. Pepper. And in terms of trying to find that happy balance between a product that will interest you but not totally overwhelm you with taste, so that, as one scientist explained to me, like turkey tetrazzini will just amaze you in those first couple of bites, but it's going to be like months probably before you have that again. But plain white bread, right, can keep you going day in and day out, and that's exactly what they're driving for in their formulations.
Well, could we just talk about this amazing new thing about this? This is how many hours?
Yeah, and it's so 7-Eleven 42nd Street. I don't know how, go there, get it. It's called Fill, Chill, Thrill. It's got some sort of coolant in it, so that now 6 hours after we bought it, it's still pretty cool, right? It was actually really cold just 2 hours ago, right? And Elizabeth, you're going to check this out for us,
right? It's got to be scary.
We talked about marketing, it was an eye-opener when I went to the people at Oscar Mayer and then Kraft that created the Lunchables, and discovered that when they were talking to each other and to investors, they would say things like, this really isn't about the food. It's about, Johnny and Susie in the lunchroom being empowered by having this thing that they can open up and do with it whatever they want. And that's the slogan, right? All day you gotta do what they say, but lunchtime is all yours. Not about the food, and I mean, you can't fault them for that, right? Bologna and cheese and crackers, right? They were like, the people who invented this at Kraft, at Oscar Mayer, were marketing people. They were totally astounded, and then they came up with the cold pizza, and they go, there's no way we can sell this to kids. And then they went to the parents and said, you're out of their minds, our kids aren't going to eat this, but they did. And what I write up in the book is that this was the gateway food for introducing fast food into the supermarket. So you started to see grocery manufacturers emulate the fast food companies in all the ways that they could. And starting with Kraft, they came out with pizza Lunchables and hot dog Lunchables and hamburger and taco Lunchables, all to be eaten cold.
But see, if you can talk people into drinking this disgusting product, and that this is choice, you can talk them into anything. I mean, they just need to change what they're selling.
And I really did want to be open to this idea that they could change. And so kind of in the end of my reporting, I went to Switzerland and met with Nestle. And first they took me to their research and development lab on the lake, Geneva. 700 PhDs on staff, all working on, some incredible things. I mean, they are playing with the size of fat globules. This could work to someone's benefit so that we sense fat more than we're actually getting in the mouth and the body. That could work, right? They tried to come up with a yogurt that was satiating so you could eat it and really be full until the next meal, and you wouldn't eat more at the next meal by adding fiber. And after about a year, they realized they had to add so much fiber that even the machine they have there that does the tasting couldn't swallow this stuff. So they're doing that, but then I go down the road to the headquarters, right, which is like this museum piece, the building itself, and I realize that This is the same company that paid $2.6 billion in 2002 to buy this brand, the Hot Pocket, which is arguably sort of one of the poster boys for the obesity epidemic. In that, this is one of the things that has taught us and played to the notion of eating from hand to mouth in one hand while you're doing something else, not paying any attention to it, the sort of mindlessness that people like Michael Pollan and Marion are fighting up against now with ideas for being more mindful. But that was my experience sort of with the companies.
Now, so how much fat? I mean, why
this is
why
a
are
lot.
these so bad?
So I added all this up by the way. So $20.15. I got for this stuff. I got 45 grams of saturated fat, which is about it's about like 7 days worth. Just 3,000 calories, right? I mean, that, a larger person might even be sort of eating that. But 5,800 milligrams of sodium, which if you use kind of, the USDA's latest 1,500 for most American adults, that's what, 4 days? And then 111 grams of sugar, and this one gives you 12 grams of saturated fat, which is about the entire day's load, and 1,500 milligrams, a whole day's worth of sodium just in this one product. My favorite, of course, and then I'll stop talking and maybe we'll get some questions. So, I'm also at the end of the book. One of the most fabulous sort of nutrition studies out there is the nurses' health study, the longitudinal, right? And the last time that researchers sort of looked at the data they've been looking at for years and years, crunched it, they discovered that the single largest contributor to weight gain, and these were nurses and other health practitioners who weren't getting hugely obese, but they were gaining weight over the years, was none other than the potato chip. And I'm at the end of the book and I'm going, what is it about the potato chip that could be sort of, overwhelmingly more alluring than anything else? And that's sort of when my food scientists started explaining to me that there's the salt, right? You just have to lick it because it's on the outside. Salt they call the flavor burst because it's the first thing that touches the saliva that then hits the salty receptor, which is all over your mouth and goes right to, or mostly on the sides, but all over as well, goes right to the pleasure center of the brain. You bite into it, it's getting that melting, vanishing caloric density thing, and that's the fat that's melting, right? Which, as you know, isn't one of the basic tastes, although they're working on trying to categorize it that. But for now, it creates a sensation that's picked up by the trigeminal nerve that goes to the same part of your brain. But what I didn't know, being naive and about food generally, was that the chips are loaded with sugar as well in the form of the sort of simple potato starch that gets, starts being converted to glucose kind of the second you use your tongue. And so it's got the Holy Trinity, right? That, and it's got noise, right? They got the studies on the noise. The package crinkles just to the right level. They know that when the chip is designed right, you'll eat more the noisier the chip is. It's got like everything going for it.
And they don't fill
That's
you
my
up.
favorite.
You could eat
Right.
a million of them and still be hungry.
That same vanishing, that same caloric density thing. Yeah.
How many grams of fat in?
So this one, this bag would set you back 4 grams of fat. So that's basically that's pretty much, that's close to a third of your whole days. And of course the sodium is a third of the day. And then, I don't know what else, Cliff Bars, I'm not really ready to talk about those, but Stacy's, right, we can't let them off. I actually have a friend, she's a journalist, used to work at the Journal, became totally hooked on Stacy's potato chips, pitas. I mean, it's worth just sort of knowing that you go in the grocery store now and there's so much health washing going on, it's sort of astounding, right? I mean, everything has added whole grains or more calcium. protein is like the latest thing, right? And yet so many of, but much of it is sort of left with still the basics. And these things, again, saturated fat is in here heavy. This has actually more sodium than the Lay's potato chips. A little bit of sugar, protein, but again, perfectly engineered, now owned by Pepsi, I want to say, and just as sort of overwhelmingly alluring to people as the unhealthy one that we all know as potato chips.
So before we open this to questions, I want to ask one question. What was in the research that you've done in the past 5 years, what's the single most startling fact that you learned?
Well, there were two. I mean, on the fun level, personal level, the executives, the scientists I met don't eat their own food, especially when they get into sort of health trouble. And part of this sort of intellectual, a lot of them just know how overpowering it is. Nora Bolkow, the head of the Institute on Drug Abuse, sort of reinforced that to me when she said, look, Michael, and she's a neuroscientist who studied both narcotics and food, and she's convinced that the highly fattest, highly sweetest foods can cause patterns of what she calls compulsive intake every bit as much as even as some narcotics. But she'll say it's even harder on food because you can't just go cold turkey. You just can't stop eating. We would die. And so every time you taste, unlike narcotics, every time you sort of taste a little bit of these things, you are back in the throes of their clutches. So that really impressed upon me. But the other thing sort of had to do with salt, because I learned that we're not even born liking salt. We don't develop a taste for it until 6 months of age. And the Monell Center in Philadelphia, which gets a lot of funding from the food industry, did some research recently showing that the food industry is hugely influential on our developing cravings. They divided kids into two groups, and those who were given basic, ordinary grocery store food were much more apt to be licking the salt shaker by the time they were in preschool. I know because my kid did that at the local pizzeria. It wasn't Franny's, by the way, Tamara here. And we confessed to the owner. But and we also know that we can get off of salt. And anybody who's been under doctor's orders to reduce sodium knows that after about 6 weeks, you can hardly eat many of the products in the grocery store. They taste so salty. But when I went to Kellogg with the question, what is it about salt that is so hard for you guys? Everybody wants you to reduce it. Why can't you? That was a real startling eye-opening moment, because they made for me several of their biggest icons, especially made without any salt in it at all, right? And so we started with the Cheez-Its. I know that's one of your favorites, I'm sure, right? Yeah. But without salt, we couldn't even swallow them. They stuck to the roof of our mouth because salt adds texture, solubility. We went to the frozen waffles, put those in the toaster, and made without salt. They came out looking and tasting like straw. The funnest one were the cornflakes, put them in milk, ate them. Before I could say anything, the chief spokeswoman for the company was sitting there with me, and she gets this look of horror on her face, and she swallows and blurts out the word metal. I taste metal. And the chief scientist is sitting there, and he starts sort of laughing. He goes, yeah, not everybody will get that, but one of the beautiful things about salt for us, it will mask some of the off notes, awful tastes that are inherent to some processed foods. The biggest trouble for them is meat, because when you re-warm meat, as in like a can of soup, the fat oxidizes and gives off what the industry calls warmed over flavor. Sometimes they pronounce it woof when they're really having fun. And woof, in their words, tastes like wet dog hair. And so the solution to the wet dog hair taste is, you guessed it, a little more salt, right? So that was the moment when I realized that salt, like fat, like sugar, was this miracle ingredient for them as a preservative, as a masking agent, as
And it's cheap.
10 cents a pound. They can avoid using real herbs and spices. There is like no way they are going to ditch that dependency anytime soon. So.
Okay, questions?
Do you want to direct? Want to care? I mean, both of us. Yeah, please. Sorry.
I might have tasted some of that food before in a moment of weakness, maybe at the airport or when I've been very tired.
God, you do have to have the Doritos.
So when you find yourselves in those moments of weakness, you're on a story assignment, where do you fall down?
Oh my God. So here's my rule of thumb, which is when I eat out at a restaurant, I don't really care. I'm going for like the richest, best tasting stuff there is, right? I mean, I was at Prune the other day and Gabrielle starts bringing out the bone marrow stuff and, I was like, yeah, okay, right? I mean, a lot of people make fun of me if they actually know it's me, and they'll like heap this stuff on me. But because I know I'll go back to kind of a regular diet when I'm back home. And and then likewise when I'm traveling, I'm exploring stuff and I'll eat things, low end stuff and high end that I otherwise wouldn't. And I just sort of write it off as being an anomaly. And like I said, when I was writing the book though, I had potato chips downstairs and that was my vending machine break. Yeah.
So I was going to ask regarding when's the genesis, and if you really kind of focus on the economics behind all this, why do companies do this, and the power of money changing our food, and how do we get back to something that's more modern?
I talk about these days. I mean, I devote a chapter to the demise of the home economic system, where girls, but even boys in some cases, are taught how to shop and cook and be mindful of food, and that happened, especially in the 80s, and even earlier, as the food giants were hiring home economists to sell their stuff to us based on sort of convenience. I don't see that coming back, but I do see schools starting to teach food in terms of power and politics and multinational corporations versus the consumer, and kids really dig that. High school, even middle school, and certainly college, and that's really, really interesting to sort of see happening. And another big thing is, people like Paulin who are writing about sort of cooking and just sort of, chipping away at this notion too that the food giants own convenience. I think a lot of that is hype and myth, and there's lots of ways you can sort of help defeat that notion just by,
I think that the thing, at some point, schools will start doing to this kind of food what they did to cigarettes, and kids are going to go home and say to their parents, we can't eat that. And I think that, it's not going to happen on a government level. It's going to happen on a grassroots level. But, when I look, my son is 24, and when I go and talk to colleges now, I mean, I see this generation who have very different ideas about food and what they will feed their children. And I see that I think it will bubble up. I mean, I do think that there will be a revolt at some level, and kids will, we never imagined when I was growing up that there could be a smoke-free atmosphere. It just was unthinkable.
Well, how about you were first in the back? Sorry.
Well, that may be about schools starting to make more healthier food, but at the same time, when kids go home and say that they want to eat healthier, parents may not have the money to necessarily buy that healthy food, because nowadays it's really hard to find healthy food or to even know how to make healthy meals every day, or to get it and to educate your children that way, because that I think is where schools and families really don't meet in between, because either one or the other can't can't hold up the end. So you have to find a bridge for that, right?
Yeah, no, I saw Ann Cooper the other day. You all know who she is. She's in Boulder now, having moved from Berkeley, trying to work on school lunches there. And she's just beside herself at how little money that the school system can spend feeding kids. But she does say, and they're starting to do great little school gardens there that aren't feeding the cafeteria, but they're just teaching kids where the stuff comes from and to get them excited about it. And the success is sort of all based on the enthusiasm of the gardener teacher to make that work. But she did make the point that those kids are going home, and because she's hearing from parents that they are getting the parents interested in buying radishes and strawberries and what have you. Yes, cost is a huge deal, and I think that's one of the big sort of playing field levelers that has to happen, because today you walk into the store equipped, knowing what you want to buy, knowing what's healthy for you and your family, and it's going to hit you in the pocketbook. It's going to cost more to buy better. There's better food, healthier food, there's no question. So,
Let me just add to that, though. But I think when people talk about the cost of food, they're not talking about, this stuff isn't cheap. I mean, they're talking about the difference between making dinner and going to McDonald's, which is cheaper. But I mean, anybody who can buy this can buy an apple.
we didn't talk about reporting process much, but that's one thing I love about this organization. It's so hard writing about these food companies. They are fortresses. I mean, they will not give away kind of the littlest fact. I was incredibly lucky to come across a trove of documents that put me at the table of the biggest companies as they're formulating and plotting and planning their way to selling new product. And it's that enabled me to identify and then convince their key people to talk to me and reveal even more secrets. And without that, I would have been dead in the water, though, because these companies give nothing. On the other hand, there's kind of no investigative reporting where you can just kind of like walk into the institution, the grocery store, and look at the thing you're looking at. And so much, in fact, is revealed if you just sort of have the background and the know-how to sort of think about it and frame it. Because they do all their touting on the front of the packages, and they do have to disclose the ingredients and the nutrient loads and the fine print. And the supermarket is such a changing, sort of dynamic place that's actually incredibly thrilling as a reporter to have that opportunity.
All right, I think we're going to have to leave it there.